There was a huge political shift that occurred just a few weeks ago. Donald Trump, after losing in 2020 in the US presidential elections, ran again and won, not by a small amount, by a landslide. He got both the popular and the electoral vote, which is huge considering the last time he won, he did not have both of those. Something else that was quite unique about this election is that a third party took a more prominent position, that is the Green Party, which Jill Stein and Bush, also an Islamic convert to Islam, were candidates for the president and vice president positions. The Muslim community took a stand on what mattered most to it, which was support for the humanitarian conflict in Gaza, and more than 50% of Muslims voted for the Green Party. This was huge, especially in Michigan, where 59% of Muslims voted for the Green Party. Keep in mind, Michigan is a swing state. So what happens in Michigan can often determine the end result for the presidential elections. Again, one of the core factors that caused this shift was Muslims' perspectives on the humanitarian conflict in Gaza. This ultimately determined who they decided to vote for or not vote for. We know many say that Muslims widely supported Trump over Kamala Harris, but that's not what the numbers say. The support for Kamala Harris and Donald Trump were quite equal. The biggest difference was their support for the Green Party. So today, we're going to have Dr. Halil support us in understanding what this means for the Muslim community, both in the US and globally. I want to just give him a brief introduction. He has a PhD from the University of Virginia. He's also an associate director at the Abbasi program, which is a program focused on Islamic studies here at Stanford. And then finally, I just want to point out that Dr. Halil is a refugee scholar. This means that he's always been willing to say the truth, whether it impacts him negatively or not. So now I introduce Dr. Halil to bring us through this awesome program.
So today, I'm not going to be so normative, meaning I'm not going to tell anybody what Muslims should do as a group. That's not my intention. I'm not in a position to lecture anybody about that, but I will try to analyze, maybe to get a sense of the Muslim landscape in the US on this topic. So, what really happened, and what are basically Muslims, what do they correspond to in American politics? To begin with, we don't even know how many Muslims are there in the US. So back in the day when I first came here in 2001, there was a mosque survey CARE was saying Council of American Islamic Relations back in the day, 7 million, another statistics were saying 3.5 million. Recently I hear the same number, so which is quite strange because over 20 years, it must have at least doubled because of all the continuing ongoing immigration. So we don't even have the exact number for that, but again, CARE, which makes these surveys, CARE is going to be a big part of my discussion, both negative and positive. So they claim that there are 2.5 million Muslims voting in the US. So the question is, at this point, can we consider Muslims as a voting bloc? Or is it a contested space among Muslims? So let's go back to another American Muslim, the beginnings, Malcolm X, from his Between the Velvet and the Bullet. This passage is very striking, I always, whenever I listen to this, when actually we talked about this, I was reminded of this one. So to give the context, Malcolm X, even though in his private life was a Muslim, in his public view, political view, he was a black nationalist. So he said explicitly, even in this speech, he doesn't mix his politics with his religion. So we may argue he may be like secular in that kind of sense. Anyways, so he's strategizing for the black nationalists. My nephew. Changing the So what he says is he realizes the power of blacks as a voting bloc, 22 million, and there were recounts in Massachusetts, and that means it was so close they had to count all over again. What that means? It means that when white people are evenly divided and black people have a block of votes of their own, it is left up to them to determine who is going to sit in the White House and who is going to be in the doghouse. So the question is, as in 2000, back in 2000, did Muslims send Bush to White House and Al Gore to doghouse? So let's check the numbers. So in 2000, Al Gore and Lieberman, they ran together against Bush and Dick Cheney, and the turnout in Florida was 70%. And actually, you know, Florida was the defining place because there were just a few hundreds of votes that determined. So if we check how Muslims voted in 2000, so in July 2000, Kerr made a survey and found out that 90% indicated an intention to vote, 25% have not decided, and Gore was ahead of Bush, 32 to 28%. November 7, after the elections, it said the same Kerr now, which said the majority voted for Steinberg. Now, like 40% of eligible Muslim voters now belong to back Bush and 25% Gore. So, is that significant? I believe it was Muslims who sent Bush to the White House. It's not exaggeration. That is a real fact. Why and how? Why did they send Bush to the White House? Okay. So, in Florida, there were, by Tampa Bay Islamic Center estimates, 55,000 Muslims, and 88% voted for Bush. That's a huge number. And then what happened? So the background is this. In Florida, Kerr and a very famous, prominent American Muslim professor, Samuel Aram, who became a textbook case later on for 9/11 persecutions and Islamophobia. So he became basically the cover for that. So he and other Muslims in that crowd, they decided that Bush is better for Muslims. Why? One is Bush promised them Palestine. Second, Muslims are actually embracing conservative values, family values, and Bush was basically embodiment of that. So that was the reason why they voted for Bush. And Samuel Aram and Kerr was behind that initiative. Then what happened? So, okay, here you can see family photo with Bush family and Samuel Aram family. And you might know them because they're all famous today, from Al Jazeera, like Samuel Aram is in Turkey now, leading an organization called SIGA. So they are basically like a big part of also supportive of Erdogan in Turkey as a family, and and always writing in propaganda pieces for the government. But back in the day, he was in the US and he was supporting Bush. A few months later, they were going to have an event, a meeting with Bush, and they would see what's going to happen, like what kind of role Muslims would play. Can you take a guess, like what could be the date of that?
September 5th.
No, September 11th, 2001. That afternoon they had a meeting actually. That same afternoon. And September 11th happened. And the meeting was off. A few years later, Samuel Aran was in jail, and he would be in jail, remain in jail until 2015, and then he would be sent to Turkey, and Erdogan gave him position in a university and also power, like financial resources. And when that happened, first Afghanistan, then Iraq. So Muslims basically realized it wasn't that kind of a good bet. And the Palestinian state also never materialized. So what can we take away from this source? From this, Muslims, I believe, like they don't always make the most rational choice, I believe. That might show that. So, I'm going to give some fundamental questions. Are American Muslims a voting bloc? Did Muslims cost Harris for presidency? Were Muslims single-issue voters, ethical voters, or strategic voters? Because all of these are being debated and people are making claims about all of these. Right? This is for C, Michigan, in 2020. So Biden got 2,800,000, and the turnout was 71% in Michigan, and Trump got 2,650,000. Let's look at now. We don't have the actual number of turnout, but it is estimated to be around 73%. So in terms of turnout, there's no difference. So either Muslims basically went to the polls, or more people from other groups had a higher turnout, and that made up for the Muslim lack of power. But we don't know. The only thing we know is CARE made another survey and said the majority voted for Trump. Voted for Stein. But there's a caveat. Who did they survey? How did they survey? And also, what kind of Muslims did they survey? If you look at the numbers that they shared, I can actually show you exactly that one. Not here, sorry. The ones who supported the ones who are regular practicing Muslims going to mosque most of the time, there are 30%, and another 30% is somewhat involved in the mosque. So 70%. So do American Muslims go to the mosque in 70%? I don't think so. So they basically surveyed only practicing Muslims and not all of the Muslim community in the US. So we can't infer from that Muslims in bloc voted for Stein. And also, the second question. Did Muslims co-carry her presidency? What do you think?
No.
Did it make any difference? No, it didn't. Florida did make a difference, this one didn't. Did it make a difference in Michigan? Like the most popular, like Dearborn and Detroit? No, it didn't make any difference. Because basically the turnout was the same, and also like the other thing, people are making this claim, I heard just a few days ago too, like, so Kamala supporters didn't turn out, Trump just got the vote as last time. Did Trump get the vote as last time? Look at this. Uh, 28, yeah. Actually, he got even more than Biden in 2020. So, how many votes did Kamala lose?
100.
80,000. Yeah.
But it was circulated in the news that the Muslim vote contributed, like, we hear more of the Muslim voters in Michigan and how they influenced the election. Where do we attribute that?
Yeah, I'm gonna get to that. But I can show you like a lot more numbers, even from Dearborn, even from Wayne County. Like I checked all of them. I was gonna share that, but then like it would be too long. But in each and every survey, data that I checked, Muslims only made a very minor difference in Wayne County.
Okay.
But that is around like 60,000. And like Trump had, yeah, around 150. Like 80,000. So where is this coming from? My argument is it is coming from actually like a desire, a wish on the part of certain brand of American Muslim community. We can't generalize that to all of the American Muslim community. Why? Because American Muslim community is actually not voting as a bloc. And even the politicized Muslims, back in 2000, they were much more united, but now they are more divided than ever. So the swing voters against her is that she was too focused on cultural issues, transgender rights. Did they play a role? Maybe, actually, it could have played a role. We don't know. But we hear some people, some Muslims saying the transgender rights was an issue for that person. What did Trump do? Trump campaigned on both economic and cultural issues together, and depicted the Democrats as focused on only cultural issues and waging a cultural war, and hit Kamala from that. But there is a more important trend in these elections. It is that right now we talk more about class being more determinative than race. In all these elections before this, it was mostly about race. Blacks voted for Biden and Democrats. Whites voted for like segment, changing in different segments. Latinos voted for Democrats. But in 2020, for the first time, Trump's margin among Hispanic, Black, and Asian American conservatives shifted 36% in 2020, and this time it is even more. More Blacks and Latinos voted for Trump now, in high percentage. And the number one issue for them is what? Economics. Yeah, cost of living, basically. Cost of living was I don't think it's an exaggeration to argue that cost of living was the main determining factor in these elections. And Trump was able to promise more because he had a record that he showed his good times from 2017 to 2020 and boasted that, and most probably, that also made a big difference. Muslim voted for Trump. What could be the argument for Muslim vote for Trump?
Family values versus the liberal.
Yeah, transgender rights, for instance. That could be one option, yeah, as we know that, some people voted for that, at least one person, because he was interviewed.
The war in Gaza started under Biden.
Actually this quote is about that, right? So,
There was,
Trump will end the war.
he had a short frame that he was talking about there were no wars under
Yeah, that was the other thing. Like, it wouldn't even have started if it weren't me. That could be a reason. But we can also infer that like the lifestyle, cost of living was also equally important for them, like, because they are also part of the general US crowd, and they also have different classes. Let me not show these, but let me skip this because I want to get to the Muslim votes as well. Yeah. Yes, Trump and Muslim leaders. So I'm quoting Turkish here only because this article was written in Turkish by an Arab, like by the very same person, Samer Aram. And what does it say? Engage, like a few extreme and concessionary groups, such as Engage, except for them, Arab and Muslim American organizers in majority voted for the other party, not Trump, not Biden, Kamala. So, and he makes the same argument in the second one, like in the other slide. He says, even though, the voting base increased, the voter illegal voters increased by 4 million. In total, 10 million votes were fewer than last time. Can we ascribe that to Muslim vote? It's very generous, actually. It is, it is bad statistics, right? It doesn't work that way. You really have to dig into them. Yes?
Is there a sense of how many of those who voted for the Green Party, how many of them voted for Biden versus Trump in 2020?
So the problem is, as I said, in American Muslim surveys, the basic challenge is, the assumption is if you're a mosque-goer, you are part of the community. But there are many people, as you know, who don't practice, but still maintain their religious identity. So all these surveys are excluding them. That is the problem.
How do we know how many Muslims in the US then?
We don't know. That's the problem too. Here, documents 2.5 million Muslim voters. But that means, I think, only that group of people who are practicing or who are somewhat involved with the mosque. So if we look at the political landscape, political action committees, actually CARE is not the monopoly there. CARE has been monopoly in certain ways, like in civil rights movement in the US. Like Nihat Awad from the very beginning, or if there was Ibrahim Hooper before, they were the founders. And Nihat Awad is still the president after 20-something years. And they want to be, along with Iqna, MAS, like by the way, Iqna is extension of Jamaat Islami in Pakistan, MAS is extension of Muslim Brotherhood in the US. So these groups, they want to monopolize the political Islam space in the US. And it is not wrong to call them American Islamists. So CARE, Iqna, and MAS, they are representing American Islamists. In the US, I don't know why, but Islamists, they don't prefer to use that label for themselves, but overseas, yeah, they have no problem with that. And the people who are basically calling themselves just American Muslim, when they go there, when they go back home, they call themselves Islamist. That is also an interesting fact. Okay, so other than CARE, a new group emerged, actually long before. However, that group became more active from 2020 onwards. That is Engage. Muslims for Harris, Muslim Women for Harris, and Engage. So why are they labeled pro-Israel? Because it is best attack to call your opponent a Zionist if they have a different opinion. So the difference between CARE and Engage is Engage endorsed Harris, and CARE endorsed, did not endorse anybody. And also CARE connected, and CARE and ISNA and MAS and IQNA connected Muslim leaders. They issued somewhat a fatwa, calling people not to vote for Harris because of a single issue that they said Biden and Harris, they funded the genocide, and because of that, we will have to show our vote. What are they trying to do? Two things. One, they are trying to monopolize the American Muslim political space, that landscape, and attacking the other group for being pro-Israel. And second, they want to turn Muslims into a voting bloc. And they have the majority of the Muslim scholars, Salafi and conservative, but they don't have all of people. So, for instance, check Ali Abu Nime, famous, well-known person from the Intifada, Muslim as a voting bloc, and Meet Engage the pro-Israel Muslims back with Joe Biden. This is back in 2020. Actually, the conflict erupted even then. Engaged people and CARE people, they were accusing each other. Actually, Engage did not accuse them. Generally, CARE was accusing them of being pro-Israel. Trying to identify some connections, something like this person is now part of Engage, but back in the day, he was at this conference with AIPAC. So those kind of connections. But the difference is, CARE is American Islamist, Engage is non-Islamist. That is actually the only difference. Yeah. Muslim imams and leaders letter to community on the 2024 elections. So they started this habit, like these American Muslim leaders, they started this habit of issuing fatwas on elections. But this is very reminiscent for us from Turkey. In Turkey, they also started doing that. These faith leaders, they getting together and endorsing Erdogan election after election. And interestingly, American Muslims of this brand also joined that crowd and said, Yasir Qadhi, for instance, was part of them, and a lot of others. They endorsed Erdogan in Turkish election. Like, why would you endorse a foreign election? I don't know. That's beyond me. But they did so. So then, like, how can we answer the questions I raised at the beginning? Are American Muslims a voting bloc? No. Part of them voted for Harris, part of them. And actually, I would say non-practicing Muslims maybe more voted for Harris than Stalin. We don't know. Did Muslims cost Harris her presidency? Didn't. That is not what happened. Trump would win no matter what. But Muslims cost Al Gore his presidency. That is a very comfortable argument. That is a very strong argument, I think, that Muslims cost Al Gore. And also, anecdotally, like there was somebody from CARE here a few years ago, and that person said, oh, it was also because it was Vice President Lieberman who was Jewish. That was also one of the reasons, basic anti-Semitism. Could be also one of the reasons. We don't know. But even a CARE person actually from that time, shared this view. The third one is more difficult. Were Muslims single issue voters, ethical voters, or strategic voters? If you look at the fatwa that was issued by the faith scholars, they again and again focused on one issue, that is Gaza. If you look at the engaged endorsement, it doesn't only say something about the Gaza issue. So they basically say it is worse with Trump on Gaza, obviously. So there's no point in voting for Trump for that, or like hurt by Harris's chances. Second, I lost the train of my thought. Engaged endorsement. Second, Kamala had a better track record in terms of social justice and environment. They were the three issues. But if you look at the fatwa by the scholars, just on Gaza. And based on that, they said we have to punish Harris. So some people call this an ethical voting. Is it an ethical voting or a single issue voting? Or strategic voting? My argument is these people, American Islamists, start playing the long game. That is the thing. What are they doing? So they want to make Muslim vote indispensable for the Democratic Party. And they want to show if you don't accommodate our wishes, we are also a lobby group. If you don't accommodate our wishes, we are going to go to the third party, as we are doing now. And we will cost you presidency. But will it change the calculation of the Democrats for the upcoming elections? We are not sure. Two reasons. One, they don't see Muslims as a voting bloc. And second, they don't think it would matter. Even in Michigan, if it didn't matter, where else it would matter? So there is still a long way to go, but that was the strategy, and because of that, they also like accused the other side in very harsh terms as sellout Zionist people, basically. If I'm allowed to be normative a little bit, and I'm going to finish with that. So there are actually two conceptions of Muslim politics. This is coming from my research. Political theory, Muslim political theory. And Abdullah Efendi actually first identified that in his book, Who is an Islamic State? It was a treatise against Islamism. So he talked about Medina model and Damascus model. Medina model is the Republican ideal that were embodied by the Khulafa al-Rashidin, the first, what Muslims call dark divided caliphs. And it was based on ethical principles. It didn't consider the strategic parts of their decisions, and it could not continue. And it gave way to the other model, the Damascus model, the model of Muawiyah. So the first Medina model is the model of Ali, and the second model is the model of Muawiyah. It was realistic, it was pragmatic, it was based on whatever they have in that landscape, Muslim landscape at the time, the empire, and whatever would further the interests of that government, that state, that would be fine. You don't need to worry that much about the ethical values. The primary value is politics. So this is a very important distinction that actually can still guide us to understand what is going on. So election after election, I analyzed like not the American one, but the endorsements for Erdogan in Turkey, and statements against Erdogan in Turkey by religious people. And what I found out, the endorsements always talked about Muslim interests. That is the key term, Muslim interest. And the other part against them talked about justice and shura and adalet. So they embraced the Medina model as opposed to the Muawiyah model that was embraced by American Muslim leaders and also like the fatwa givers in Turkey, who are scholars. So why is this important to, like identify whether it is a single issue or ethical voting or strategic voting? So of course one can be both at one point, but looks like the fatwa givers are more like single issue voters and they are playing the long game, is my argument. Again, I'm not, like supporting any one of them, by the way. I'm totally just observing. The ethical voters, who call them like ethical voters, actually like if you want to do ethics of Muslim voting in the US, what would be your priority? What is good for humanity? What is good for the environment? What is good for the nature? Which one is going to bring more peace? Which one is going to establish social justice and justice? These are the issues, basically. Like if you want to follow the Medina model, then yeah. But if you want to play the long game and pursue Muslim interests, then you can make all sorts of calculations and you can vote even for Trump. You can say, yeah, Trump is going to be better for us, like one way or another. And that's why actually like a lot of overseas governments, they all are united to support Trump. And we can't also exclude how foreign governments are also involved in US Muslim landscape, especially Turkey and Qatar. And you can, if you like look at Middle East Eye, you can see like this whole line of talking points of care. Who is funding Middle East Eye, do you know? Do you fund the donors? Or like the sponsors of Middle East Eye?
The country, the GCC.
Qatar and Turkey, influence operation. Yeah, Middle East Eye is an influence operation owned by Qatar and Turkey. Yeah, basically when Al Jazeera was tarnished at some point, they decided to team up and then do that. And like it is very ambiguous, like you cannot find the donors, the funders of that. They keep it in the dark. Anyways, that's what I wanted to say. If you want to, follow the Medina model, then of course you have to consider what's going to bring more peace for the whole world, not just for Muslims. If it is Muslims, it is Muslim interest. But for the whole world, whether the oppressors are Muslim or non-Muslim, because Muslims are not just oppressed, they are also oppressors. So, who's going to bring more justice? Who's going to bring more peace? Who's going to bring more good for the environment, for the nature, right? And also you can see who the minorities basically want to vote, because minorities are generally more or less persecuted people in most countries. And who they vote for also is a signal of what is going on in terms of the political landscape. Anyways, I want to end with these comments. Thank you so much for listening to me.
That's awesome. We have about 5 minutes for a couple of questions. I want to just kind of kick this off by just asking a clarifying question. When you say single issue voters are long-term focused for Muslim interests, by that, do you mean overall international political interests? Or what do you mean by that? What do you mean?
So unfortunately, a lot of immigrant-led American Muslim organizations, they see US as an extension of their local politics. Turkish Americans, they say, what is good for Turkey? Arab Americans, what is good for Palestine? It works that way in their minds. So that is a problem. So you really need to first prioritize the people here. But also it is important for the whole world, because the US presidency is actually the presidency of the whole world. So everybody actually should have a right to vote, like people all around the world should have a right to vote for US presidency elections. It's basically bonding without taxation and without voting. It's a different deal. But that is what I mean by single issue voting. Like if you base the whole argumentation on, for instance, Gaza, then that's a single issue voting. But it may depend on different calculations, and if you are more strategic about that, and I think the American Islamists are more strategic about that, they want to play the long game, even though in the short run, it's going to maybe hurt them with Trump, but in the long run, they calculate that Democrats will have to take Muslims into consideration as a voting bloc.
Any other questions?
Yes.
What do you think it will take, is it a change in the census or how this data is collected to get a better understanding of the Muslim community in America? And do you think if we did get a better understanding of how big and diverse the group is here, that would increase or decrease their power? Because is some of the power of the Muslim voting bloc their anonymity and the fact that we can't directly prescribe whether or not they are voting as a bloc?
Can you rephrase the question?
So, if it's revealed, we get all this data on Muslim Americans and realize that they're all over the place, then what may matter to a majority of Muslims will be deprioritized because they're not seen as a strategic voting bloc. But right now, after this most recent election, it's perceived that the Muslims have voted as a bloc, even though, as you argued, that may not be the case, and therefore they might be gaining more power.
Yeah, so what would happen if it was found out that Muslims were more diverse? I think they already know that. Like Democrats they already know that because they engage, and engage is getting involved with them, engage is endorsing them. So as long as they have engaged, then it wouldn't matter, and that's why like the Shia part is so pissed with engage, because it is preventing them to monopolize the American Islam landscape. Only their version of like politics, American politics, would be okay for them. Yes.
So historically, why has it been so hard to figure out what is the percentage of Americans in the U.S.? Because what you said was intriguing, how the number hasn't increased in the past 20 years. Like, what's going on in the background there?
I honestly don't know. Like, I'm not in the part of political science that is doing more about like data. But that thing amazes me from the very beginning. Like so many different numbers. What is your opinion? What do you know about that? Do you know anything about that?
I can say that in New York, particularly since the probe after 9/11, there were quite documentation of the number of Muslims in that area, but generally I haven't seen any national effort, or at least as of late, to have that kind of data available. Since my impression is like the insignificance of the population on the national stage, but on a local stage, say like in Michigan or in New York or in these hubs where that block of Muslim community is more concentrated, there would be more of a focus, but on a national stage, no.
Aziz?
Yeah, I'm just curious about the American Muslim identity over the years. It survived the 9/11, then 20 years later, how would it look like in the future? This kid was 17 years old, Muslim. Do they feel safe? Do they feel enabled that they can build a company, work, succeed? How would that look like?
Again, like I'm not in a position to issue like normative judgments about anything, but what I see is as an observation. So back in the day, American Muslims were embracing liberal Islam more than other versions, especially in the academia. You would find lots of treatises on Islam and democracy, Islamic democracy, and that's what I wrote my dissertation on. And they were too complacent and with liberalism. So something changed in the academia. Muslims became more involved with academic left, and social justice and liberation, they became like the big now slogans and big concepts, and they started to propose liberation theology, inspired by the liberation theology of Latin American Christian churches. And that is more about like politics now, because they also combine it with new theories of caliphate, and caliphate as embodiment of Muslim power. It's a power project basically, as opposed to an ethical project. So back in the day, in 2000s, you would find, for instance, Halil Yenigun was defending democracy as an ethical good. So the argumentation was on the ethical level. But now it changed, and I was at a workshop on Muslim politics last year, and like there was a presentation about caliphate by a prominent Muslim author and academic, and like the whole thing, it was all about what would make Muslims more powerful. But there was nothing about what would be the most just solution, what would be the most ethical solution to this problem, that problem. But what would make Muslims more powerful? So if you reduce Islam into identity politics, and that's what you get. If you want to build an Islamic theory, and I don't see any anymore, by the way, it is all about caliphate theories and liberation theologies. To a certain extent, yes, actually that was my critique as well to liberal Islam. However, I would still rather prefer Muslims, arguing on ethical foundation as opposed to pure politics and identity. So basically, yeah, Islam was reduced to identity politics now, and whatever we see as pluses and minuses of identity politics in the US with other identities, now it carries that. And the thing about Gaza is there's a new way of, I don't know, you know it better, Marcus, but there's, I think, a new way of radicalization among Muslims. I don't mean radical by in a negative sense, because like that is radicalized, DSA stuff, how did you radicalize, that kind of thing. So a lot of American Muslims are much more radicalized now than, for instance, the time when I was doing my PhD in Virginia. That time, yeah, it was more like they were all trying to prove that we are moderates. But I don't think there's any concern about that anymore. Nobody's. Just like, white Americans, they took shelter in Trump and Trump in politics, that kind of identity politics. The same way, all these different groups, Muslims included, who are doing identity politics, they took shelter in strongman. That's why you find American Muslim leaders issuing endorsements for Erdogan there, or Imran Khan, or whoever like the strong man is overseas. Because it gives them strength, just like Trump gives the white man strength.